Greetings and welcome to TH430 Christian Ethics, Session 2. We're going to be talking about Gilbert Mylander's second chapter, Human Nature and Sin. Now, one of the first thing he points out is that sin, just by definition, implies some sort of imperfection. But of course, talking about an imperfection, whether you're talking about human beings and sin or anything really, implies that you have an idea of the way things are supposed to be. How could you know something is bad or deficient unless you had an idea of what it looked like to be sufficient? So sin implies a defection of human nature. So any inquiry into sin presupposes an inquiry into human nature, which is where Mylander goes. And he wants to talk about human nature by kind of setting up a dichotomy between nature and spirit, necessity and freedom, the finite and the free. So you kind of have this two-part of a human being, which aren't really apart, right? But we separate them to describe them. And that's important to know. It's not as though we're a divided person with a body and a soul. Well, those are together. However, in terms of describing human nature, it's helpful to kind of be able to distinguish between them and differentiate between the two, which is what he does. So you have kind of body, nature, necessity, finite, spirit, freedom, and the ability to kind of responsibility and agency over here. Okay. So he uses the 50-foot building illustration. If you were thrown off a 50-foot building, he points out there are truths about the experience that simply would not be captured, that's incapable of being captured through the language of velocity and mass. Okay. And he's absolutely correct about that. So what he's trying to point out here is, yes, your body in this situation is completely subject to all the laws of nature. So in that sense, right, you have no freedom, no agency, no kind of responsibility with respect to your falling off the building. You were thrown off, and you can't negotiate yourself out of gravity. You can't negotiate yourself out of falling and the velocity. There's no theorizing out of it or something like that. Like, no, your body is subject to the laws of nature, and you're going to die here in a matter of seconds. At the same time, you are self-aware as it's going on, because you're not just a body. Okay. There's this other part of you that can articulate what's going on because you are self-aware. So this is really, really amazing. As a human being, there is part of you that is completely materially caused and is subject to all the laws, material laws of nature, but there's another part of you that is not subject to those in the same way. So you have these two different kinds of realms where there's necessity kind of built in. Material necessity, right? A causes B, causes C, right? You throw me off the building, I'm going to fall, I'm going to hit the ground, I'm going to die as assuredly as if you hit a billiard ball into another billiard ball, it's going to go into the pocket. It's just the result of material causation. However, there's another part of you that we would consider very kind of personal, spirit-orientated, where we have kind of situated freedom, and understanding and self-awareness. So we can articulate, right, ourselves via words and grammar and syntax and assertions and value. And there's necessities and boundaries built in to this non-material personal element, right? I mean, you can't speak words you don't know. You can't use grammar you don't have, right? So there are some limitations. But what's interesting is that on the material side, right, we see material causation, right? Things like like gravity, material necessity. We see these as kind of impediments to freedom and agency. But the necessities over here in the spiritual, right, in the kind of freedom area, in the personal area, the necessities of, let's say, language, I think, is a good way to get at this. Those necessities, rather than being obstacles to freedom or agency or responsibility, are actually expressions of it. Okay. So, a necessity in the spirit kind of freedom agency kind of realm is, we would say A equals B, B equals C, therefore A equals C. We get that. We get that. And there's a logical necessity there, but that logical necessity is not some sort of obstacle to human agency or responsibility or freedom. It's actually an expression of it. Okay. So this idea that having necessity inherently subtracts from personness or the spiritual or kind of the human is just not true. What we're talking about are different kinds of necessity. Material necessity does take away from human agency. Okay. If somebody walks to the top of the 50-foot building and jumps off, you say that person committed suicide. They're responsible for that. They did that. Why? Because they threw themselves off, right? Okay, there's responsibility there. If somebody throws them off that building, you don't hold them responsible. They're victims of outside causes, right? The outside causes inhibited their responsibility and their agency. Like, you don't hold them responsibility. Why? Because they were materially caused. They were thrown off, right? They themselves were not the cause in the spiritual, personal kind of sense, right? That you would say if they jumped off. Okay, so you have within the human nature this kind of coming together of both kind of the necessity, the finite, the human body, but also the human spirit, the soul, these things together within the human being. Okay. So because we have this joining of, body and soul, that we're kind of both of these things together, that we are subject to the material world, but at the same time, we can transcend it. We have to talk about transcendence a little bit. And I bring this up in the other video with Greek ethics because transcendence is important there, especially with respect to imagination. Notice how our use of language and our ability to imagine gives us the ability in our minds to go beyond what we are physically kind of tied to. I love this image here, right? You have three people at a computer, but notice what their imagination allows them to do. Okay, because they have imagination, this person can transcend his place and his time so that he's flying as Iron Man through the sky. This woman can transcend through her imagination both time and space to be on a tropical island enjoying a cocktail. This is hilarious. We all know this guy, right? We all know somebody who, if given the opportunity, they have no imagination, and what they would see themselves doing is exactly what they're doing, which looks like he's trolling somebody online or something like that. Okay. So we see examples of this ability for us through language and through our imagination to be able to transcend what we are doing. Like oral history is able to transcend time, written history, right? Our own memories. They give us the ability to access something that no longer exists and conceive of things that could never exist, right? Flying unicorns, for example, being Iron Man, all right? So we have these kind of two parts of us, right? We have the mind and we kind of have the body, and they're together in us. Each of them have their own kind of necessity. One necessity is a necessity that is proper to the body and is the result of material causation over which we have very little control. And then the other side is a necessity that actually helps give expression to our agency, freedom, and responsibility. Okay, so you have these two. Now, both of these necessities, however, both the contingent and the transcendental, the material and the spiritual, both of them are reliant upon God. Okay, both of them are reliant upon God. So in the material world, where the body is subject to the necessities of the laws of nature, we're still the body and everything that's material is reliant upon God because He is the creator, the sustainer, and upholder of all creation, right? This is just first article of the Apostle Creed kind of stuff. Nevertheless, the spiritual, the transcendent, right? This is also reliant upon God. And what I mean by that is, even though we talk about freedom, and we always think, unfortunately, as Western Americans, we think of freedom primarily as freedom from, which is, I think, a bad way to conceive of freedom. It has its place politically, but in terms of ethics, freedom from is really an empty concept. What freedom really means is the ability to do what it is that you were supposed to do, right? So freedom doesn't mean I can do whatever I want. No. Freedom, true freedom, is the ability to do what it is that you were supposed to do, right? You will know the truth, and the truth will do what? Right? It will make you free, set you free. Translation, I don't like that as much. But it makes you free, okay? So even over here in this transcendent, self-aware, spiritual sense, the way God created us is all of that necessity, right, was meant to have God as both the source and the goal of transcendent thought and action, okay? So in other words, our relationship with our Creator anchored what it meant for us to be good, right? You couldn't understand what it meant to be good. Now that's a transcendental, spiritual, personal kind of a term. That's not a materialistic term, right? Good. You don't go out and find good and mine it out of a mountain or something like that, right? No. Good is a value. It expresses a proper relationship between objects, right? Well, where was that supposed to? How am I supposed to understand myself and the things around me as good? Well, that all was supposed to come from God. It was anchored in Him. Okay, so transcendence was never neutral, but it was appropriate to our human limitations through God's love. Okay, but notice how this helps us understand sin. Okay, because what happens? Well, we as human beings, through Satan, through the fall, reject our relationship with God, who anchors our identity in this transcendent kind of part of us, this kind of responsible agent part of us, rejects God. And so now, instead of having God anchor our notions of good and bad and identity and authority, now we try to fabricate them ourselves out of creation. Okay. And then you're getting to the heart of sin. Because even then, the rest of creation materially, right, groans under the weight of sin. So you have this break with God that happens kind of on this very personal, self-aware kind of level. And then it has all these implications for the material world as well, because now God says, all right, now things are going to die, right? That's the punishment. You are going to die. Death is going to be the result because of what you did. So it's interesting. Sin has both these implications for how we understand how we live. And now we're going to experience misery and sadness and fear and all these terrible things. And we're also going to live in a world that wants to kill us, right? Because now death is the order rather than life. Things are not moving towards life anymore, right? Things are moving towards death. Everything in this world, both spiritually and physically, because of sin, is moving towards death, right? Life to death, life to death. and this is important, this is kind of a fast forward, there's only one place where you see a movement from death to life, and that is in Christ, and that is in Christ. So he'll talk about sin in terms of really pride and sloth. The pride one I think is pretty straightforward. Pride is the struggle to live as though we're not dependent. Okay, he talks about it as a war on the truth of the universe, which I thought was pretty good. We want to live as God, as the creator, right? And not be the dependent creatures that we are. Because notice, in the material world, we're completely dependent. We don't get to write the laws of natures. We don't just, program our own hearts or like when and where we're going to be born. It's ridiculous. We are so utterly dependent. But there's also necessity built in to the language, self-awareness, and freedom. All right. It is absolutely dependent upon us having the right ultimate at the center of who we are. And that is meant to be our creator and redeemer and sanctifier God. And when that's no longer the case, there are huge problems with pride. And so pride is us wanting to be at the center of things. Now, interestingly, he mentions that both pride and sloth are both antisocial. Okay, so you have pride being antisocial in the sense that we put ourselves above everyone else and see everyone else as essentially an accomplice to our desires. That's all they are. That's all they are. That's what pride gets you, right? You're only judging people, circumstances as good or bad with respect to what they get you. But now, when he talks about sloth, this is a little bit different because sloth for him is more of an anxiety. And I think that's true. We think of sloth as just being laziness, but it's really a retreat from reality, isn't it? It's a desire to do what's most comfortable. It's a retreat from reality. It's looking to kind of soothe your worries in something that is mindless and something that will help you to avoid having to exercise the true freedom that God has given you, right? And so he talks about this insecurity. We have a fear of losing the customs and routines that make us feel comfortably, and it inherently distorts these things that we think are good because they're comforts and they're helpful, but it distorts them because they're never meant to be ends in and of themselves, but we turn them into the source of our security and our identity. And eventually, what they breed is apathy and boredom. But it creates isolation as well because we don't want to reach out and do the things that we're supposed to do, and we view our comfort and our desire for security as the highest good. So once again, we're just using the people around us, and this creates more and more isolation. Now, it's interesting. Isolation, I think, is the primary concept by which we should understand hell. Okay. Hell will be a complete isolation, being cut off from both God and creation, right? For eternity. And we can't even begin to think about this. So a person who is an unbeliever now still experiences all the wonderful gifts that God provides for his creation, both physically in terms of sunlight and air and all of these things, but also socially in terms of having other people and all of these kinds of things. It's interesting, if you're in a prison, and somebody does something that's bad, how do you punish them? I mean, what are you going to send them to jail? They're already in jail. So when you're dealing with the worst hardened criminals in the world and you really want to punish them, you know what you do? You put them in solitary confinement, don't you? Yeah, that isolation will drive a person mad. Okay. And so isolation is essentially from both life, both from God and from other people, is kind of what hell is all about. And so you kind of have this demonic, satanic movement, both within pride and sloth, to isolate ourselves both from our Creator, right? And also from the good gifts that God has given us, using them in the proper way and exercising freedom according to the way that God determines through His will. So what this means then is that sin is not something we do. Okay? Sin is something we are, right? This deficiency that we have in both our mind and bodies, so that we no longer are able to be the human beings that we're supposed to be. This is a condition, okay? And if it, here's one of the issues: if it's something that we do, if you think of sin as something that we do, then all you really need is some therapy, right? You just need to modify your behavior, and then you can take care of sin. This is why people like works righteousness is always so closely associated with an idea of sin as doing, right? I can fix this. I change my actions, and now I've taken care of sin. Well, look, if sin is something that you do, well, then the law works. Just go ahead and follow the law. Fix yourself. Of course, what's going to accompany that? Either pride, like look how good I'm doing, or despair, a form of that anxiety of sloth, like, oh, I'll never be able to live up to so and so is doing so well. But if sin is a condition, there's nothing you can do, right? God has to take care of it, right? Which means you have to die and be raised, which is exactly what Jesus did. So the death and resurrection of Jesus gives us the fullest picture of sin as a condition within human nature, right? God, the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God, becomes incarnate in the flesh to die and rise, because that's exactly what has to happen with sin. Sin has affected both the nature, okay, and it has affected our ability to even think of ourselves as God's people, as human beings, fully human beings. So He comes to restore all of that. So this, human nature in sin is always the starting point for talking about any kind of salvation or justification. I'm convinced that, for example, the joint declaration on justification that was signed by some Lutherans about an agreement between Roman Catholicism and Lutheranism about the nature of justification. The only way that understanding of justification makes sense is if you fail to see sin for what it truly is. Okay, so this is why the doctrine of sin becomes very, very important in terms of understanding salvation. But you can't even understand sin correctly until you get human nature correct and recognize that we are both body and soul, governed by different necessities, one physically caused, one an expression of our freedom. But both of those necessities have now been perverted through sin and death, such that we can't live the way that we ought.